Good evening and welcome to Essex FA's Ramadan Awareness Webinar for League Committee members. My name is Millie Morgan. I'm the Equality and Inclusion Officer at Essex FA. We'll be joined tonight by Nick Emery, Head of Development and Investment at Essex FA. Your presenter for the evening, Kevin Coleman, who is Head of Diversity and Inclusion at the BBC, and Asad Qureshi, who is the Football Relationship Manager at Sport England, formerly a Football Development Officer for West Riding FA. So loads of knowledge to draw on for this evening's webinar. Thank you again for taking the time to join us to be on this webinar, listen and continue the further education around the equality and inclusion space. We aim to give you a brief background to Ramadan and some guidance and tips on how to support clubs and players through the Ramadan period to ensure that nobody sees Ramadan as a barrier to participation in football if they choose to observe any religious period. If you've got any questions, please use the question and answer feature and we will be sure to answer them all at the end. Going forward though, if you've got anything after this evening's webinar that you want to ask, please get in touch with myself and we'll be sure to answer any of your questions or queries. But for now, enjoy the webinar and over to you, Kevin.
Okay, so good evening everybody. This is the first of 3 webinars on Ramadan and football from Essex FA. My name is Kevin Coleman. And let me introduce, co-presenting with me is Asad Qureshi, and more about Asad and a little bit more detail about him later. So why are we here? So Ramadan is a key festival or period in the Islamic calendar, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. And it's a time of religious observance that can have an impact on football. So we're here to talk to you about what it is, why it can impact on football and how you can deliver football and be inclusive of people celebrating Ramadan at the same time. So if we could go to the first slide. So first of all, Ramadan is something that's celebrated by Muslims. Who are Muslims? Muslims are people who follow the religion of Islam. They make up a big proportion of humanity, almost a quarter of humans, 2 billion people across the world. They're split into 2 main groups, Sunni and Shia. That's a small detail around the way that people follow their faith. But an important thing to note is that they're spread across almost every country in the world. And there isn't a typical Muslim. People look different and celebrate in lots of different ways. In the same way that Christians, Hindus and Jews do the same way. Most UK Muslims are British-born Muslims, so people have been born and brought up here. And often they're part of families and communities that have been here for generations, decades, sometimes hundreds of years. So Muslim communities are well embedded into British society and as a result into football. Around 6.5% of England and Wales are Muslim, according to the 2021 census, and that's people who have disclosed that fact. So the reality is probably slightly more. And within Essex, because we're talking about football in Essex, about 1.5% of Essex are Muslim. And if you go closer to London, closer to the metropolitan boroughs that are on the border of Essex, those proportions are higher. So that gives you an idea of the makeup of Muslims in the UK. If we could go to the next slide. Okay, this is what it looks like in Essex. So as you can see down at the bottom there, the boroughs that are closer to London, Newham, Redbridge, Barking and Dagenham, a lot of those boroughs very close to West Ham and some of the East London professional clubs, but all of the boroughs and local authorities have some proportion of Muslim communities. So Muslims, mainly these communities are Bangladeshi in heritage across East London, but also there's quite a big African contingent. So the majority of, for example, Nigerians are Muslim in faith. But you will also have a lot of British Muslims and some people will be first generation. So you have a real mix of people across Essex, and that will mean that those people as well will probably celebrate and show their faith in really different ways. So one of the key learnings from that, like a lot of diversity and inclusion, is that you shouldn't stereotype or imagine that a Muslim looks or sounds or practices in a certain way. Okay, next slide. So what is Islam? So Islam is one of the Abrahamic religions. So it's coupled with Christianity and Judaism, and there's lots of similarities across those religions. The religious books are the Quran for Muslims, the Bible for Christians, and the Torah for Jews. And if you read all three books, and they're quite big, but they're well worth a read, there's quite a lot of similarities, quite a lot of historical figures are mentioned across all of them. But in Islam, there are 5 key pillars, 5 key things that are the foundations of the religion. The Shahada, which is when you declare, you say, you know, I'm Muslim, I believe in God, I believe in the Prophet, Muhammad being his final messenger. Prayers, so Muslims are asked to pray 5 times a day at set times. Fasting, otherwise known as Saum, which is part of Ramadan, which we'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute. Something called Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia. People are asked to do once in their lifetime if they can afford it. And finally, Zakat, which is charity. So Muslims are asked to give a small percentage of their wealth, around 2.5% every year, to help others. So there are 5 key things. So it's relatively simple to remember. And that's what all Muslims will know and will practice their faith around those 5 things, but in different ways. So let's go on to the next slide. And now we go on to Ramadan, sometimes known as Ramzan, depending on the language that people might speak. So it's a period that goes on for 1 month, 1 lunar month. So that means it's 29 to 30 days. Obviously, back in the time when Islam started, we didn't have digital clocks and things were done according to the sun and the moon. So that's why every year, no one knows exactly when it's going to start and exactly when it's going to finish. But with the advent of technology, we know roughly to around the day, either way, when it's going to start and finish. And this year, it's going to start around the 22nd of March, go on for 29 to 30 days till the 21st of April. And during that time, one of the key things that everyone remembers, and it's one of the key things that might impact football, is that adult Muslims, so anyone who's gone past puberty, are expected to not eat or drink or smoke during daylight hours. So as an example, around the first few days of Ramadan, that will start around 4:30 in the morning and finish around 7:30 at night. Obviously, as the days get longer, so does the amount of time people need to fast. It does sound difficult, and it can be, but the more you do it each year, and as you go through it each month, people get used to it. Our bodies adapt really amazingly. So that's the key thing, and that's one of the main reasons that it impacts football. Obviously, people are going to be a bit dehydrated, lack energy, and this may be a reason why they might not want to participate in football training or playing. Also, outside of fasting, people are very, very focused on their faith. It's a time when people spend a lot of time with family. They spend a lot of time in the mosque. People pray more. So there are nighttime prayers called Tarawih, when people will go to the mosque in the night, in the middle of the night, after they've eaten, and will participate in prayers with the congregation. So people are often quite tired in the daytime, and their schedule can change quite significantly. So that might be another reason why people might not participate in football, because their focus is elsewhere. So some people, as you can see in the last point, don't need to fast. So people who are physically unwell, if they're traveling, or if people are pregnant, and if there's a sensible medical reason. Islam, like other religions, don't want people to get ill or to injure themselves. So common sense prevails, and some people don't fast if it doesn't make sense to do so. Often very elderly people as well, or people on certain medications might not. So they're the sort of parameters around which people's lifestyle change, and they might not be playing football or being involved in football. So let's go to the next slide. So what does Muslims do during Ramadan? Well, as I said, they fast during daylight hours. So here we go, between 5 and 7:30 at the beginning of Ramadan, and towards the end, which is mid-April, it stretches to 3:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. Quite long days. People spend more time praying with mosques and the family, and children are less likely to fast. So if you're involved in youth football with kids who are younger than puberty, there is less chance that they will be fasting, but they will still be spending time at home with their families around people who will be. So their schedules will probably change too. Assad, I wonder, Assad, I'm from London, North London. Assad is from up north in Halifax. Do you find people practice Ramadan differently? How do you feel it impacted on football from your experience?
I think it varies, like you described. It just depends on the person. So I've got groups of friends who won't play football, who don't want to play football during the time. I've got the group of friends I play football with on a Sunday will still play during Ramadan. Some out of that group, again, they'll just abstain from playing because that's what they want to do, whether it's they want to spend more time doing things like learning more about their faith or charitable work, that kind of thing. For some, it'll just be a case of physically they just don't want to put themselves to it. So it all comes down to the person. And I think you made a great point earlier on. It's not to assume that everybody's the same, because it's easy to assume, oh, you're Muslim, that means you won't be playing football over Ramadan, will you? Well, actually, for some, they will be. Well, absolutely, of course, they will play football. You'll have professional football players who will fast and still play during Ramadan. So I get that's the best bit of advice that you gave early on, was just not to assume things about every single person. And you know what? I think religion's a journey for a lot of people as well. Not every adult Muslim will fast for whatever reason. They will have their own reasons why they might not do it. I think it's just about knowing that as well, and probably just recognizing everybody's different in lots of different ways, but just in this context.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, obviously, people who are Christian or people who are Jewish, not everyone's the perfect Muslim, not everyone's the perfect Christian, not everyone reads every word of scripture and follows it to the letter, and people have different interpretations of what it means. Because many communities are from Asia, so in the UK, there are many Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Indian communities. You might see very traditional food. So if you see that picture up there, people often eat a lot of dates. They will eat a lot of fried foods, some of that because it's traditional, eat a lot of fruit, but also some of it for scientific reasons. You know, it's written historically that people eat a lot of dates, and actually, sports scientists recently have discovered that dates are one of the sort of wonder foods. A lot of tennis players have switched from eating bananas to now eating dates because of all the nutrition and the simple sugars that they provide. You mentioned professional footballers, and it's interesting how they practice. They're often quite subtle about it, but when I previously worked at Brentford, a player called Ben Rama actually fasted every day during Ramadan, and the club adapted their training routines and their diet specifically for him. And he and a lot of players actually have found that they sometimes perform better during Ramadan, even though their body might be slightly underfueled. They were so focused and so sharp that actually they sometimes played better. So it's really, really interesting to see how different people approach it. Okay, next slide. So how could this affect you? So obviously this is about you, how you run your football. You're on here because you want to be more inclusive. It might be that you're not quite sure what to do around Ramadan, or there could be an issue. But also it might be that you're just interested and want to provide a really good service for some of those teams that might want to play. Some players might not want to play, as Assad said. You know, people might be due to timings or due to just being so affected, in the change of schedule and not eating. Some players might request changes of kickoff times, so they can do everything. They love their football. And interestingly, within all faiths, there is actually lots of mentions within scriptures around looking after yourself and your body and keeping mentally and physically fit. So football is absolutely something, and all sport, that is recommended by faith. So some people see that as part of their faith, to look after themselves, keep them fit, and keep them mentally and socially in touch with other people. And some people just won't want to train, and
You're on mute. Gone on to mute, Kevin.
the key thing there, I think, is to speak to people. Some people will look at this, and some people, one thing that's really key, I think, is that people won't realise the dates. Many people, the dates will creep up on them. They're so focused on faith and family that they will forget to notify their clubs and leagues. And then suddenly clubs and leagues have dates that have been arranged months in advance, and suddenly there's a little bit of conflict and a bit of crunch time. So the key here is that communication from all sides is really, really important. In youth football, which may well be the majority of football that you're looking at running, there's no set age when Muslims fast. It's mentioned in the Quran around puberty, and around that time people become adults. So that's why adults are expected to fast. But many families will encourage their kids, or the kids will be really, really keen to join in with what the adults are doing. So that you can't really assume anything. And the best thing to do is to either have a dialogue with the children, or probably better still, the parents. Obviously, you'll be aware of safeguarding approaches, and and being age appropriate in the way you talk to children and their families and their parents. So depending on the age, speak to the parents or the young people about how they approach Ramadan. One tricky area, and I think this is the one where you will probably know, because you'll know your clubs better than us, is when you have mixed teams. So when you have teams that are not predominantly Muslim, or not predominantly non-Muslim, you'll have a mix of players from different backgrounds, and you won't know to what proportion those players are Muslim and how practicing they are until you actually speak to them. And they might not know themselves how many players it will impact and how they're able to fulfill fixtures. Let me ask Assad, did you have any experience of those kind of situations where you had not whole teams that might play or not play, or not teams that weren't Muslim, but you had a mixed team, and I guess it depended on how many players were dropping out that fixtures could be fulfilled?
Yeah, I mean, I previously used to work at a county FA, so around this time of year, or probably like in about a month's time, you would get phone calls and you'd speak to people. I think something to the dates at the moment fall in and around sort of semi-final and final season, which is when people get, obviously it's a big day, so it gets more heightened. I think when it comes to teams, it can be, there's always going to be two sides to the argument. Someone's always going to want to play the game as it stands. Someone's going to say, no, we've got a reason not to. I think most league committee members will be wise to football in terms of, people saying things for various reasons and political reasons and that kind of thing that happens within leagues. I think the best thing you can do is just to try to get as much information as you can, and then be as flexible as possible. So one example that springs to mind is I had a women's adult team, relatively new, had a mixture, was quite a diverse team, but had a decent number of Muslim players in their team. They had a cup semi-final that was due to be played on the day of Eid. They asked the league to postpone it. The league were quite adamant that they wouldn't postpone the semi-final, reason being that the final was already booked at a certain place and food had been ordered and programs had been, programs were getting prepared and things like that. And I think in the end, I was able to convince the league to look at it from a flexible point of view and say, well, actually, how bad will it look if your semi-final of your flagship competition, a team drops out and someone goes through to a final on a bye kind of thing. So they probably saw it more from that point of view, and what they did, they ended up changing the dates of the game. And I had to pull a few strings from my role at County FA because it was taking place at our venue, so that made things a little bit easier. But just by showing that flexibility, what it meant was you've actually kept those players for the season after, and you've actually got a group of supporters coming to watch that team saying, oh, they've changed this fixture because of the requirements of the players. This game actually could be for us. Those reasons that put us off in the past, actually, maybe people are allowing us to play and helping us to play, and sort of, respecting our I guess, our wishes, and, wanting to practice the faith. So I think that could have been a negative example. It would have been easy to cite the rules and go, no, you signed up for a competition and you need to play because of this. League showed flexibility, and I think they've benefited from the end, because I know that now there's more than one team that's got a diverse makeup in that league. So I guess in terms of that, I think it's something we all want to see anyway, diverse players playing for teams. So I guess that's probably an example that springs to mind, although it doesn't totally answer your question of, trying to work out whether a game should go ahead and things like that. But from a league's point of view, that's always going to be my biggest sort of suggestion. Just be flexible and to really speak to the teams involved. And I know it's hard for leagues. I left county a few years ago, and I've stayed away from jumping into leagues because I know how much hard work it is, and I know that it's like a full-time job running leagues. So I've got a lot of respect for people that do run leagues. But I think, yeah, the more flexible you can be, the more players ultimately, which is what we all want. We all want, more teams, more players. The more flexible we are, I think the better chance we are of getting to some of those sort of goals. So hopefully that helps, that example.
Yeah, it does a lot. And actually, that reminds me of a point to note, is that, as we said, Ramadan happens around the same time each year, but because it's based on the moon, it changes and it becomes about 10 or 11 days earlier each time. So that means that it's going to fall within the football season, probably for the next 10, 15 years. If you work backwards, so if it gets 10 days earlier each year. So it's right in the sort of business end right now. So cup finals and the end of the season. You'll see an impact, I think, at the last World Cup. I don't know if you saw the famous situation where the Tunisian players, the Tunisian goalkeeper fell over out of nowhere in the middle and feigned an injury so that the other 10 players could go and get a drink at the side of the pitch. And obviously we don't want that happening in grassroots football. So it is something that will impact football, especially at this time of year. You might ask, for example, well, why do we not do the same webinars for Christian dates or Jewish dates? And that's a very valid question. They will have an impact on football, but for most other faiths, most of those dates are single days. So you like your Easter Sunday, you've got your Easter weekend, which could have an impact, but I think leagues are probably more aware of that. Diwali, Vaisakhi, they are usually just one day, one date, whereas this is 30 days. And there are very few other periods where people are not eating, drinking, and are not participating in most of their normal activities for a whole month. So that's why we specifically put on this webinar. So if you could go to the next slide. So we partly covered this, but let's go over again because we've got the score here, standard code of rules. So it will impact different clubs and leagues differently. Some will want to postpone fixtures, some will carry on as usual. So as Asad said, the key here is dialogue. You'll know most of your clubs and teams, but you can see this as an opportunity to speak to them, get to know them a little bit more, and the better you know them, it's easier for you to avoid any issues in future and to build up a good relationship with them. One easy thing that you could do right now is notify some of your clubs that Ramadan is due to happen on the dates. So not just the Muslim clubs, who will hopefully know, but also the clubs who are playing Muslim clubs. It will be a bit of an education for them. and it will warn them that there's a possibility that there might be a change to some of the fixtures. It will give them, there's a lot more understanding across society generally, on TV and in the media. There's lots of talk over the last few years around what Ramadan is and what Muslims do. So I think there's a lot more understanding, and if people know what's happening, they're going to be a lot more sympathetic to any changes. So it might be a way of avoiding any tension or friction. Ask clubs and players if they're going to change fixtures to tell you as soon as possible if that might be an issue. Again, people aren't perfect, people have busy lives, and even if someone is Muslim and they might be fasting, it may well have passed them by what the dates are. Under FA rules, it's rule B29. You can't compel people to play football on bona fide religious occasions, save for when they've signed up for it. And that's the letter of the law, and that's correct. Like anything in life, going back to that example of professional players, they often have this quandary where they've signed a professional contract that says they will play every match and they will fulfill all those obligations, but they also have their moral and religious obligations, and the two things, most professional contracts don't take account of Ramadan, so they have quite a difficult choice sometimes, and the clubs support them to be able to fulfill both sides. But usually clubs and leagues, you're all there, as Asad said, to support people playing football. And I think the further in advance you speak to people, the easier it is to smooth off any time there is any conflict or any clashes. And again, planning going forward, if you are setting the dates for next year's County Cup, for example, or anything in the future, it might be something to bear in mind, knowing that the dates are going to be 10 days earlier next year. So if we look at that now, that will be something like 10th or 11th of March to 10th or 11th of April in 2024. Let's go to the next slide. So we've mentioned Asad a couple of times. So we've known each other for, gosh, a very long time. You haven't aged at all from that photo, nor has Harry Kane. I don't know what you guys are eating. So Asad has been in sport for quite a while. I know you worked for a local charity up in Halifax. Up there it says the Himmat Project. You were at West Riding FA. You're a coach, mentor and affiliate tutor, and now work for Sport England. Do you want to give us a 30-second potted history of the things you've done in football?
Yeah, cheers, Kevin. So I guess if I'm being totally honest, before those sort of roles come up on the slide, I wasn't doing very much. I had a lot of sort of, I'd call really boring jobs. Worked for my cousin who ran a post office, and it's probably one job that I'd say to young kids, try to avoid working in a post office. It's pretty boring. So in essence, for me, volunteering at the sports project mentioned on there, and that was sort of the start for me. And then I was lucky enough to be able to sort of work my way through from working in community to working for the county FA, the FA, now eventually at Sport England. I think I've been pretty fortunate along the way that I've met quite a few good people along the way, such as yourself, Kevin, and others as well. But I guess some of the principles that I mentioned earlier, just in terms of speaking to people as much as possible, I think that's probably something that I value quite a lot. And I guess getting information from people is probably something that I hang on to quite a bit. I guess in terms of my current role, my role is basically to try and get as much of the country as active as possible through football. So for us, it's working with people, almost getting them out of the house to start with, to start taking part in any activity, ideally football, because football is my background and my passion. So working within football, getting them to a point where they're sort of regular participants, and then it gets handed over almost to people like on the call from the county FA, the FA, and the leagues and competitions that are out there. So yeah, my role is probably to work within recreational football as almost like the early stepping stone to try and get people involved with sport, because of the benefits they get from it. And to be fair, the benefits I got from it as well in terms of my career. So that's a brief sort of background on me, and I guess I'm sure the guys from Essex will share contact details later on. Feel free to share mine if anybody's got anything they want to get in touch with, either about Ramadan or the work we do at Sport England. feel free to get in touch. I'm more than happy to speak to people and support them where I can. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Thanks, Asad. And sillily, I didn't introduce myself properly at the beginning. So my name's Kevin Yusuf Coleman, and I worked in sport. And like I said, just about 23 years. I started in tennis, but worked at Kick It Out, the anti-discrimination campaign for football. Nearly 10 years at the FA as equality manager, and then at Brentford Football Club. And like Asad said, I did a few boring jobs. But really loved my time in football. The passion that you meet, that people have for the game every day, is quite inspiring, and the power that football has to bring people together. So even though we're talking about today where there could be a little bit of conflict or tension, actually it's overwhelmingly positive when you work with any community, and they know that the governing body, whether it be Essex FA or the FA or Sport England, is really interested in getting people and helping people play football and enjoy the game. In my time at Kick It Out, even though I was dealing with a lot of discrimination complaints, the vast majority of contact I had with people was really positive. It was people that just wanted to play, that had found a purpose in life, had got physically fitter and made loads and loads of friends. And it was only because now and then there are issues that they couldn't resolve, they got into contact with us. Still, their passion for the game was usually lifelong. And you can see that through the people. I guess everyone on this call probably can see that in the teams and the managers and the referees that they deal with on a weekly basis. So here's the final slide. Here's a couple of resources. It's always good to signpost people to things. There's the FA have brought out a really handy fact sheet. It will cover most of the things we've covered today in a little bit more detail, and that's on the FA website. The Muslim Council of Britain is almost the sort of governing body of Muslims. It's a voluntary organisation, and there's loads of useful information. They usually bring out a guide if you want to read a bit more about Ramadan, usually 20 to 30 pages. And quite an interesting read. And if you want to know about Muslims in Britain, there's a really useful website. There's one person who's voluntarily put this together for years and years, and he has charted, where Muslims are, what the communities are made up of, where their mosques are, and so on and so forth. So if you wanted to know about your local area, who those people are, where their mosques are, and what they do, and their background and their heritage, that free website gives some of that detail. Hopefully you've found this interesting. Does anyone have any questions or queries about anything that we've said today?
We do have a couple of pre-shared questions, if that's okay, Kevin.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, can we just ask about how long within a game is a sort of reasonable time for a game to be stopped during Ramadan to break fast, if a league is to be sort of advising a referee or a club of what's the best sort of space of time?
That's a really good question. I guess you could say how long is a piece of string, but I think Asad will probably have more practical experience on this. What would you say?
Yeah, I guess again, there's no set rule or unwritten rule anywhere, but I think I guess you look at what period they're using, like the Premier League, or what teams do use, and you're talking about something that's probably sort of 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes long. In terms of breaking fast, what you're probably going to get during a game of football, nobody's going to have like a full-blown meal. It's just going to be that we'll get some liquids on board, we might have a quick snack, just to basically see us through till the end of the game. Many will want to probably use fruit or dates, like Kevin said, to open the fast, and they're sort of things that probably to have a few dates or a snack, a bit of fruit, and take a bit of drink on board. That's sort of 5 minutes. So I'd be talking around about probably like 5, maybe 10 minutes. I think if you're being pretty clever, what you could do is time half time with that. So if it means adjusting your kickoff, and they did it in the Premier League, didn't they? I think was it last season or season before, where they can either delay kickoff or bring it forward slightly to make sure it sort of hits half time. So that almost saves not having to stop the game, and it also gives that 15-minute break for everybody to do what they need. So if you can't time it with half time, I'd be looking at sort of 5 minutes, maybe 8. And I guess I would use if I was a referee, I'd probably ask the referee to just speak to both captains, almost like you would do in any other incident that involves a referee. Speak to both captains, get the nod from both groups of players, and then get the game going from there.
Yeah, and incidentally, that is what happened in the Premier League, even though it wasn't publicised. The two captains and the two clubs spoke to the referee before the match. It was all well arranged, and at a set time, players would simply go to the side. The useful thing is that obviously people have been fasting all day, and usually people's stomachs have shrunk and they can't eat a lot anyway. And because you're in the middle of a game, you wouldn't want to have a burger and fries. People would probably eat 1 or 2 dates and some water. That's as much as most people can have anyway. And if you're playing in a game, you wouldn't want any more. So 5 minutes is probably as much. But as I said, speaking to the captains and agreeing it beforehand means that it can probably go really, really smoothly.
Thank you.
Great.
And if we're asking for a best practice sort of scenario, how early should a league reach out to their member clubs to ascertain whether fixtures need to be changed or whether that club will be affected by Ramadan itself?
I would say as soon as possible. Asad will probably know. Go, you start, Asad.
Yeah, so I used to sort of advise leagues at the start of the season, so AGM time. So most leagues do their AGMs, June, probably July. What I used to advise the leagues was that they should basically highlight it at the AGM, but also contact all the clubs to basically say, if you think it's going to be going to affect you, please let us know in advance. And my reasoning for that would always be, if, for example, there's going to be a team that needs to miss 4 weeks worth of games, 4 weekends, 4 fixtures, you could play a couple of those early on in the season, sort of August time, while the weather's decent and you might be able to get evening games in. And then you could stagger a couple, so there are a couple were later as well after Ramadan. So you can plan for that at the start of the season if you're aware. And I think there's a little bit of me as well that was almost saying, look, from a league's point of view, if you've advised clubs early on, I think you've not done your job, but you've started to do your job. And then I think it needs the players, it needs the clubs to do their bit as well, to come forward and say, oh yeah, thanks for reminding us. We weren't thinking that far in advance, but thanks for reminding us. So we're advising you that we think it will affect us and this is how it might. These are the things we can put into place to negate that. So for me, start AGM time when you're planning for the season, when you start looking at dates that affect leagues and cups, your semi-finals or finals, plan them in advance. And yeah, best practice, maybe a follow-up again a couple of months once the season started, once you know the makeup of your teams and you get to know probably the diversity amongst your teams as well. It might be worth dropping someone another reminder. And I guess it shows a bit of interest. Oh, well done for the diversity of your team. I'm just wanting to double check, will this affect you? I think that's pretty good practice. And if I was a club receiving those kinds of messages, I think that's pretty good customer service from a league. So they're the kind of things I'd promote.
Yeah, and I'd always say, realistically, I'm always trying to be realistic, knowing how badly people can plan things. And at the start of the season is perfect practice, but around now, a good month in advance, a reminder when people will practically be thinking about what they do in their lives. They'll be booking time off work if they need time off work, and they'll be planning social activities with community and family. This is probably another good time when people will be planning the rest of their lives, and you'll get them in the middle of that. So probably now is the other good time to speak to leagues. And as I said, some people might, a large number of people might not change, but the fact that you've shown an interest and you've started that dialogue will go a long way just to help you generally with those clubs.
Thank you. And final question we've had requested is, what's the best way to manage a scenario where a member club hasn't supported another member club in breaking fast or postponing or changing fixtures, or they've been a bit trickier on that side of it with a club who would like to be Ramadan sort of aware?
Asad, this is the sort of go on. You tell us your experience.
It's a great question, because what it does is it tests everything that we're talking about, and it does add a bit of realism to it. I think, and speaking in football terms as well, I talked about teams competing with each other. If I was, a team that was vying for, if first was playing second and we were vying for a title, and I wanted to get an advantage over the second team, I could be awkward around it and go, no, we're not gonna do that kind of thing. And I guess it's just probably you've got to appeal to the better nature of people ultimately, and because there's an education piece there as well about why it's important. I think ultimately as well, there's a bit around what we want from the game in terms of fairness and what does the game actually stand for. So I think we need to promote that kind of stuff and, appeal to that. What is an honest win, and how you want to compete with teams. It's about being fair. I think then at times, as bad as it sounds, it might be looking at what sort of mechanisms are in place, such as the referee and that kind of thing, saying, can the referee make the kickoff at such and such a time? But I guess it's a great question, and one that I've not totally got the answer to, as you probably fathomed. They're the avenues I would go down, because at the same time, what we don't want to beat somebody over the head with this stick and say, oh, you've got to do this. We want to try and get people to think about it themselves. But yeah, great question. They're probably the few points that I came out with, and I don't know if Kevin, you've got anything to add or anything.
Yeah, I think I'd echo some of those points. The FA's mantra and ethos is football for all. And all the county FAs, you can mention the work the county FAs are doing around the code of governance and all of the inclusion work that's included within that. The fact that the county FAs have inclusion advisory groups and all the work the county FAs do to include everyone in the game of football. And this is just one of those aspects. It's enabling people to play rather than people being difficult at all. It's making the game inclusive rather than trying to inconvenience anyone. You can use the rules. The rules are there on the isolated occasion when you might have to use them and people can't be compelled to play, but that very, very rarely ever happens. And as you can guess, the fact that I'm saying it hardly ever happens is being proved because we haven't actually ever had a situation where it's ever gone to the FA and there's been some sort of decision rules wise where anyone has been absolutely forced to play. It's always been worked out between the league, the county FA and the teams. And I think that's as right. Sometimes we can be cynical, but actually most people will bow to their better nature. And if they understand the situation that someone's, or the point of view that someone's coming from, most people will be as inclusive as they can be. There is a requirement on Muslims as well, not to inconvenience other people and to be respectful. And if we want people to change times or venues or dates, we need to be respectful and considerate of them. So there's an obligation on the club that wants things changed to give people enough time, reasonable time, to do that. So it's everyone working together, and the more communication hopefully that happens, the more that people will probably have a better relationship going forward.
Thank you. And finally, just to follow on from that, how can we ensure that a league's clubs and referees are as upskilled as the leagues that have attended or watched tonight's webinar?
Good one. Well, we have two more webinars, one for clubs and players and referees. So we have Farai Hallam, who's a level 2 referee, and has been a former semi-pro player, who's also at the Premier League. And we've got Butch Fazal, who is the FA's coach diversity manager, all coming on similar webinars to this, which will be recorded and shared. So everyone will have that same opportunity for the same information. And there's some other interesting and similar information on the FA's website.
Perfect, thank you. That's all the questions that we've got from for tonight.
Great. Yeah, and as we said, Asad and I are open for any more questions that anyone might have. If you suddenly think of something when you're going to make a tea after this, you wish you'd asked, just drop us an email. And we've been doing this for a long time, so we're more than happy when someone's interested enough to ask us a question.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Asad. Just wanted to say, yeah, big thanks to you both for coming on tonight. Really good contributions and great insight into kind of Ramadan and how it could impact football, and how best to support kind of stakeholders out there around that period. As Kevin said a couple of times there, the thread that runs through from the FA through to county FAs, including Essex FA ourselves, is football for all. It's a really diverse part of the world, Essex, and you saw the sort of figures that were presented early on around the diversity across our 19 local authorities, including 5 East London boroughs that we cover for grassroots football. And we really like to celebrate that diversity and want to make sure everyone's supported, and we talk about safe and inclusive environments for players and coaches and referees. So this just forms a part of that. We've had a wider equality, diversity and education and inclusion education program running through the last couple of seasons, and more will follow. We've done some stuff on LGBT communities. We've got more to follow around newly diverse children and young people and how they can be supported in grassroots clubs. So this work, we know it's an ongoing education piece, and these are just small snippets really to help the wider workforce across grassroots football in Essex to feel supported and be able to provide that environment for the people that are involved. So yeah, thanks to Kevin and Asad once again for your contributions tonight. It's really helpful, and thanks for Millie for organising. If there's leagues out there or people that are watching this recording back, get in touch if you've got queries, as Kevin said. Come through Millie, come through the football development team. All the contact details can be found on our website. So yeah, thanks everyone once again, and we'll close it there.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.